Welcome, everybody. We're really excited to have you here for this bonus webinar. Thanks for joining us on an especially beautiful day. Meg, if you could launch the first poll. While you're signing in, it'd be great if you could just take a moment to complete this brief poll that'll help our speakers know a little bit more about you and about your knowledge of today's topic. Thank you. So we'll give folks just another minute or two to sign in. And again, if you're just joining us, please take a moment to complete this poll. And we'd love to learn a little bit more about you and what you know about today's topic. So we'll give you about 45 more seconds or so. Thanks for joining us today. Once again, welcome and thank you for joining us. If you have just a quick moment, please complete this poll. I'll give you another 10 seconds and then we're going to get rocking and rolling. 4, 3, 2, 1, bink. Okay, so let's share these results and I tried to share the results. I guess it's already being shared. Thank you, Meg. All right, so just so everybody can see, for today's professional background, we have a mix of folks that are involved in forestry and conservation policy and a few wildlife biologists and a couple of folks that are interested in recreation or all of the above. The majority of folks are joining us from Maine, and then we do have some people that are joining us from other parts of New England and from outside of New England. Everybody today has heard of the emerald ash borer, so I'm glad you have. And do you know the cultural importance of this ash tree species to the Wabanaki tribes in Maine? So you're going to learn a lot today. So welcome. I think Aaron's going to kick us off with our formal welcome, and then we'll get right into the meat of it.
Well, thanks, Amanda. And again, I echo Amanda saying that this has been a great webinar, and this was a bonus episode that we pulled together just because of the great past months that I think really capped off nicely with Dr. Ivan Fernandez and all our other colleagues with last month's call. This was kind of to set the stage for a potential webinar going forward, and it's a timely topic, so we really appreciate everyone joining us on this and looking forward to today's discussion and again being a very interactive environment. This webinar series was meant to bring together scientists and forest managers as well as the general public to talk about broader issues related to climate change. It's done in conjunction with the University of Maine Center for Research on Sustainable Forest and the Forest Stewardship Guild with Amanda and Logan Johnson. Today's topic, as Amanda indicated, is an important one, the emerald ash borer and kind of the implications it has for cultural resources in Maine and throughout the New England. Today, we got a panel of very distinguished members. Dr. John Daigle is a professor in the School of Forest Resources here at the University of Maine. Tyler Everett is a PhD student, also at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources. And Emily Francis is also a graduate student within the School of Forest Resources as well. So today we'll turn it over to Amanda in a second and get going. I think this is a really timely topic and is on a lot of people's minds. But we're also joined by members of the Penobscot Nation. And so I know we've acknowledged land in the past, but I really think that's pertinent today. So we want to really respectfully acknowledge the Wabanaki, the people of the Dawnland, are the original forest stewards of the land we're discussing today. In particular, the University of Maine is located on Marsh Island, which is in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites is ongoing. The University's Center for Research on Sustainable Forest support the forest research and education and outreach in the homelands of the Penobscot Nation and other Wabanaki tribal nations. We strongly support the inclusion of Indigenous science and values in forest stewardship management and research, and we really respect those that are joining us today. and look forward to today's discussion. So with that, I turn it back over to Amanda and look forward to getting this going.
Thanks so much. And thanks again to everybody for joining us. Just briefly, for all of our participants here, if you can just take a moment, picture a family heirloom or a tradition, something that's really important to you, whether it's, a ring, or whether it's furniture, or maybe it's a recipe, something that's been in your family for, a few generations. Now, imagine that something happened and you know that that tradition is likely nearing its end. How would you feel? Probably not so great. Now, imagine that you can do something to change that outcome and sustain your heritage. How do you feel now? So today, we're really excited and blessed to be joined by three speakers that are going to tee us off for today. I wanted to open with just a quick quote. If you missed the pre-reading, I definitely want you to read it. There was a great video interview with Gabriel Fry, who's a Wabanaki basket maker. And a quote stuck out to me. He says, "My daughters will probably be the first generation in millennia that won't be able to pass the tradition on to their kids because of the emerald ash borer." So with that, today, this webinar focuses not on the climate vulnerabilities, which we have covered a lot in the past series, but on the common solutions of managing ash for resiliency against EAB and climate change. Solutions must involve changes in behavior in forest landowners and managers. So in order to establish a baseline and identify specific areas that would change this behavior, the UMaine team is preparing a survey. This webinar is going to be different from other webinars. We're going to have a brief presentation in the beginning, and then most of it is going to be a series of polls and discussions in the areas of landowner knowledge of ash, monitoring, and forest management. This session is going to help inform the important work of these tribal members and U of Maine students and faculty in their efforts to protect brown ash in Maine's forests. So without further ado, John, if you want to share your screen, we'll get going with the formal presentation part of today's session.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and I want to also thank everyone for joining today's webinar, and especially with this beautiful day that we have outside today, taking the time to be part of this is very appreciative. And I also want to acknowledge my students, Tyler Everett and Emily Francis, that will be helping with the presentation today. And there's, three ash species in our state: white ash, used for handles, furniture, baseball bats; green ash, which is used as an University of elm trees that were there. And of course, brown ash. And brown ash is significant because this is the Wabanaki tribes, and for millennia. It's such a very special tree. It's actually part of the creation story for the Wabanaki. It's what we would call a cultural keystone species for the Wabanaki people. And again, I don't know if you can see me, but here's the basket. My grandparents were actually basket makers. These are the ones I helped them make back in the 1970s. And it was really, helping them to make those baskets. At that time, the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance was formed because of, interest in kind of reestablishing more basket makers. And my grandparents were actually important in terms of reestablishing and teaching some of the basket making. And of course, the Maine Indian Basket Alliance really was helpful in doing better marketing and getting better prices for the tremendous work that goes into making baskets. So I really kind of gained an appreciation of basket making when I was young. And of course, with the climate change research that started a decade or so ago, I really started to think about, what could be the potential implications for our ash trees in the state of Maine. And this is just one of the, early on, it's a kind of habitat suitability conditions for tree species. And this happens to be the black ash, and you can see the range of black ash where it's quite prominent here in the Midwest area of Minnesota, Wisconsin. There's actually groves of black ash that grow in that area. But as you go across the northern tier of the United States, it's intermixed with our forests. And in Maine, it's really throughout the state, and not a big component of the forest, but it certainly is present in our forests. And so that's the current range. And this was what I was seeing with some of these early models of the habitat suitability as we see climate change impacts. And you can see it declining here in the northern part of the state. It's kind of these green is more dense, yellow is less dense, but you can start to see it kind of gradually moving out of the state. Oops, sorry. And it was really these initial projections that got me interested in working more with tribal communities in the state of Maine about the potential implications of climate change on our ash trees. And it was at that point in time, a lot of community members started expressing, what fear of what they heard of what was happening in Michigan with this insect called the emerald ash borer, and the impacts it was having on killing ash trees and the implications it could have on basket making. And that's what really started to refocus some of the attention at the University of Maine and research that we were doing in terms of trying to learn more about this invasive species, the emerald ash borer, and start planning around the arrival of the emerald ash borer. And this is just a graphic. Whoops, sorry, I'm getting too trigger happy there. This is a diagram of the spread of the emerald ash borer, and in 2002, it has rapidly spread across the United States, and it's now in the state of Maine. I'm going to minimize this here. You can see in Maine, it arrived in 2018 up in northern Maine, and then soon after in southern Maine. And so it is in our state. But what I have to say, though, early on with some of the efforts that we did involving the Maine Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the APHIS program, which is the Animal Health Inspection Safety, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. Early on, we started to look at the emerald ash borer and helping to plan and manage. And we were very proactive for the state in terms of implementing an emergency order for banning the transport of firewood into the state of Maine. And I have to say that the Maine and the efforts that we've done, I think has contributed to keeping EIB out of our state for such a long period of time. And we still have the majority of our ash in our state at this point in time. And I think it's really through those kind of collaborative efforts. And as Amanda talked about, things are going to change, but hopefully we can influence to some degree the rate of spread that occurs with EAB. And again, some of the collaborative efforts that we've been involved in over the years, has brought more awareness with some of our actions. We did a Maine public television special on the importance of black ash, which I think helped to bring more awareness. But I think now that EAB is actually in our state, it's closer to home. I think more people are becoming aware of the emerald ash borer and the damage it can cause to ash trees. So we're kind of transitioning into an important period of time here where I think we're going to need more collaboration among private landowners, helping with monitoring and with management strategies in combating EAB and trying to retain ash as part of our Maine forests. So we're kind of in a very important time period where we're kind of transitioning. But again, just one more minute here, you know, a lot of effort has been going on the past 10 years with collaborations of folks. And we actually made a trip early on to Michigan to kind of see the effects of EAB for the first time. This is a ash tree harvester, basket maker, Gabe's brother, Richard Sillyboy, Butch Jacobs, basket makers. These folks have been involved with our collaborative planning for many years, and they continue to be. This is Jennifer Neptune, who's the president of Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance. And so there's a really good group of folks that are working together, and will continue in the next few years as we face EAB spreading in our state. And of course, there's also the federal and state entities that are also involved. This is a purple trap. Some of you may have seen these in places in Maine as we've been monitoring for EAB. So with that, this is a little bit of background, but I think we want to start asking a few more poll questions, because as again, we're kind of looking forward here and preparing for doing private landowner surveys and a forester survey around some of our efforts with dealing with the emerald ash borer. So can we start to bring up the next set of poll questions? Great,
thank you. All right, so that was a great background and introduction to today's topic. I know everybody wants to learn more, and there's way more than we could cover in 10 to 15 minutes. So for now, the rest of the webinar today, we're going to have 3 sections where we've got poll questions we'd like you all to complete, and be sure to scroll down in case you can't see all 4 questions. Please be sure to scroll down. So please complete the poll, and we'll give you another 30 to 60 seconds. We'll see how quickly you all participate. And then we're going to have a little bit of discussion about some of the topics that came up in the poll. This first section is on landowner knowledge. And then we have 2 more sections. One is on monitoring, and then the last one is on forest management. So stay with us. I'll give you another 20 to 30 seconds. You're doing pretty good at filling out this poll. It's nice to see the results coming in. Thank you. And if you do have questions at any point, if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to type them into the chat window. If we have an opportunity, we might allow you to unmute to ask a question out loud, but we'll start by asking you to type your questions into the chat. All right, I'll give you another 10 seconds to complete the poll. 3, 2, 1, think. Okay, I am sharing the results. So I'll just recap what we're seeing out loud for the benefit of the recording, and then I'll ask our speakers to address what we're seeing here. So, are you living in a location that is currently identified as a quarantine zone because of the presence of EAB? About half of the folks here said no, a third said yes, and a few folks are just unsure. What percentage of Maine landowners do you think are aware of emerald ash borer's threats posed to ash trees that may be on their property, or the dangers of transporting firewood or ash trees that may be infested? So folks, there's sort of an even split for what percentage of people of Maine landowners that are participants today thought were aware of these challenges. So some thought it was less than a quarter, some thought it was a quarter to a half, some thought it was half to 3/4 are aware. Some thought that folks are very aware, but nobody thinks that all landowners know everything they need to know. So if you had brown ash on your property, would you consider providing access for harvesters to potentially harvest selected trees for sustaining cultural practices? 3/4 of you said absolutely yes. Another 17% possibly with some additional details, and another person is unsure. Roughly what percentage of brown ash trees are basket quality trees according to brown ash harvesters? So most of you think that about a quarter of brown ash trees are basket quality. We'll learn a little bit more about that in a moment. We're going to stop sharing, and I would love for our speakers to address all of those poll questions. What did you see and hear, and what questions do you have for our participants today?
Well, thank you for participating in these poll questions, because it's very, very interesting And I think we'll start to see maybe some of the challenges moving forward as we try to combat this emerald ash borer. But one of the more important elements is kind of knowing where EAB is and what actions we can take. And you can see that most of you indicated yes or no, so that's good. A few of you mentioned that you are not sure. We're going to actually bring up a map here in just a couple minutes that shows our current quarantine zones here in the state of Maine. One thing that's important to note here is that earlier in the year, the federal program kind of deregulated quarantine zones for interstate travel, and which is very important, something that we didn't quite want to see here in the state of Maine since we still have most of our ash. But the state of Maine has decided to continue with quarantine efforts to try to contain that area where the emerald ash borer is, which is very good. But it's always going to be a moving target, right, as emerald ash borer keeps spreading. So how we keep people informed so that they know if they're in or they're out is going to be very important. And with question 2, what percentage of landowners do you think are aware? This is one thing that we're hoping to try to get a better understanding with our survey work of private landowners in the coming year, just to kind of gauge where people are at and how we might become more effective in our outreach efforts and making people more aware of the emerald ash borer. So this is very interesting. It's not really known at this point what percentage, but we're hoping to get a better understanding of that this coming year. I'm really glad to see the response to question 3 and the willingness of providing access to harvesters as we have a future dwindling supply of brown ash. It's going to be more difficult to access. We are seeing that in Michigan with some of the basket makers there, where it's becoming more difficult to get ash, find ash. So having the cooperation of private landowners is going to be really important in the future. And again, with the last question here, most of you are really spot on. It's really a very small percentage of brown ash trees that are what we call basket quality trees. So a lot of times landowners are quite surprised if they do provide access for people to harvest their brown ash. They're only taking 1, 2, 3 trees out of that property. So it's barely seen, really. There's also kind of, site characteristics that dictate, the quality of brown ash and how many trees are brown ash. But generally, it's really a small amount of trees that are what are called basket quality trees.
Thanks for that background, John. I think if you want to stop sharing the PowerPoint, we can see kind of the group discussion. And I wonder if Tyler or Emily want to share some reflections or additional information about the questions. Yeah, so John, I think you would stop sharing if you go to the top. Yep, there we go. Okay, now we appear as if we're in a So hi, everybody. All right, so thank you, John. I'd love to hear Tyler or Emily's comments.
Yeah, no, I appreciate everybody contributing to the poll. I think we didn't maybe explain in detail the idea, but with this survey, in the story of emerald ash borer, we've got a couple different players in the story, and so we've got foresters and loggers. They're managing the resource or putting that management recommendation into action in the forests. And then for the landowners, these are the folks that have ownership of woodlots that have the resource on it. And so it's the goal of the survey to kind of figure out what their familiarity is with some of these topics. That's why we didn't tell you, this is the quarantine zone. So are you or are you not in the quarantine zone? It's kind of a test run. We're trying to see, before we share that information, how familiar are you with the policies that are in place, where the quarantine boundaries are? We could get into even more detail of what's allowed. Kind of a gray area if you don't have a familiarity with it. Let's say you have firewood sitting outside by your shed, and you have a camp up here in Jackman. you might throw that wood in your pickup and head to Jackman. Well, if you're in a quarantine zone, technically that's breaking the law. You can't bring that firewood outside of the quarantine zone. And that could be a poll question, right? We could ask that and get more detail on that. But that's the idea, is we're trying to figure out kind of the baseline perceptions of landowners in terms of this forest health issue. For one, to help us bring awareness to it, but also to come up with ideas of where the knowledge gaps need to be filled and what can we do to help fill those knowledge gaps? What resources can we provide? So I appreciate everybody's input. And if you felt like you were in the gray when you're answering the questions, that was intentional. And we don't mean to make you feel like you're not aware, but sounds like we've got a really great group of aware folks. Did really well on a lot of these questions that the answers that John spoke to were spot on. Do you have any thoughts, Emily?
I think I'll wait and hold on to comments for later so that we can make sure that we get through everything that we want to talk about.
I think
thank you everybody for answering.
I think we do have time if you wanted to say anything. We have a few minutes still on this topic.
I like both Tyler and John have said, thank you very much for answering the questions. I have a background in geography, so I'm really interested in like, where does everybody actually live, and how do people know if they aren't in the quarantine? So I'm excited that there are people who know that they're in the quarantine and that they are aware of those boundaries. And I think that that's really heartening going forward with some of the work that we're going to be doing when we create a larger survey to administer to private landowners. So I'm very excited about those answers. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And if folks have questions, again, you can type them into the chat window. I'm also wondering, I have a question for our participants. What else do you think our presenters here might want to consider as they prepare to survey forest landowners and forest managers? This section right now is on landowner awareness. But what are some impressions? Like, how well do you think landowners that you work with, or that or that you have, how much do you think they know about EAB, about brown ash on their property, about management options that can help increase resiliency? I'm going to actually change security. We have just a couple minutes here. So participants, you now have the ability to unmute yourselves. So please feel free to type a response or a thought into the chat window, or unmute and to speak aloud. Thanks.
Well, while those responses are coming in, I did want to add, so my background, I did work as a consulting forester for a number of months and worked part-time for the Passamaquoddy Forestry Department. That's kind of where I am now. So that's why I'm tuning in from Jackman. But one thing I did notice, so when I'm working in Jackman, a lot of the tribal community members that have a concern about emerald ash borer happen to just know so much about the forest health issue, about the pest, about basketry and ash trees in general. And then in my work as a consulting forester, there was a lot of interest. So landowners would, once I brought this idea that, I do a lot of work with brown ash and inventory work, and, we're always looking for sites to do that work and possibly open it up to harvest by basket makers. There's a lot of interest. A lot of folks wanted to go down that route. They're not sure if they had brown ash. That was really common. Not a lot of landowners knew if it was brown ash. You might know that there's ash on there, but is it brown ash? And they know of emerald ash borer, but just the difference in awareness between some of the basket makers and harvesters that I was working with and landowners was a big disconnect. And I saw that there was an opportunity to kind of provide that insight, both in terms of emerald ash borer, forest management, forest health, but also the cultural significance of ash and hopefully that's something we can convey with this survey.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Tyler. We had a comment in the chat that farmers are a group who own woodlands that need to be reached out to about EAB and brown ash. So thanks for that suggestion. I think we should probably turn to our next section. Roger says in the chat window, brown ash knowledge among foresters has been historically limited by the fact that it had been considered worthless as a forest product and had not been included in inventories. Good point, Roger. Thank you. And I think for brown ash in particular, it's not considered much of a merchantable tree, but it has a whole lot of value beyond merchantability. So thanks for that comment as well, Roger. All right. I think we probably better launch our next poll, which is on monitoring. So take a moment, please, participants, and let us know your responses to these questions about monitoring. And Nancy, thanks for your comment as well. You know that brown ash in particular might be considered in inventories, but just listed as ash, not segmented out further. We'll give folks another 30 seconds or so to complete this poll. And again, please scroll down to make sure you get all 3 questions that are in there.
And Amanda, did you want me to bring up that one slide where we have the quarantines?
I'm tempted to wait until if we close the poll, but if you want to be ready to.
Sure, okay, I can wait.
Actually, you know, if you want to start bringing it up now, we'll give folks another 10 seconds to complete the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Pink. Okay, ending the polling and sharing results. So we'll get to talk about John's side in just a moment, but first a quick recap of this poll. So how close to you is the nearest emerald ash borer infestation? Interestingly, for one of you, it's in your town, but for over half of you, it's in the neighboring county. Others say it's in a bordering state, and a few people say that's in New England somewhere. Nobody said that they were unsure. So at least you have an awareness of generally where the nearest EAB infestation is. I'm sure Emily's going to have a lot to say about the geography of those responses. Have you seen any purple traps or trap trees used to monitor for EAB in your area? Almost everybody said yes. So that is pretty exciting that you have seen the purple trap tree somewhere. Let me see. And then our third question, how important do you think it is to participate in efforts to monitor EAB, such as the trap tree network? So for our very skewed audience here, many of you said it's the highest priority. And if you didn't, you said it was definitely important. Let's see, Mark shared about the poll. There wasn't a clear option for more than one county away in Maine. So thanks for that clarifying comment. And I guess I think Emily and Tyler will note that as they develop the real poll, but this is helpful for folks to reflect on. So from our presenters, John, do you want to go to that monitoring slide real quick? So it's slide 7 in your show. We'll see if we can just take a quick peek at it.
Yeah.
Let's see. So, okay, so that's it. And if you go into presenter view, then we should be able to see it. You could say go view and then start from this slide. Play from current slide. There, that should do it.
Okay. Yeah, we wanted to illustrate. I know Gary Fish is on the line here too, that can add any more detail, but this is one of the latest slides that's available from the Maine Forest Service website, which incidentally, I really need to commend again the Maine Forest Service on being proactive with some of their outreach materials. You can actually get on their email listing for forest health, and they have a great section on the emerald ash borer to kind of stay up to date on its spread. And this map was taken from the Maine Forest Service website, and you can see the current outbreaks of EAB in our state. And And again, when you see reporting done by the APHIS program on a national scale, they tend to report by county. And again, with, you have more detailed information that's available here in our state with the Maine Forest Service, where you have actual locations of infested areas. And it is really kind of the red area there is where we have our infestation areas. But importantly here is that most of our ash, and we have about 400 million ash trees that are greater than 1 inch. I think that's the inventory assessment of, from the Maine Forest Service. So we still have quite a few ash trees in our state. And this really gets to the point of helping with monitoring efforts and the role that maybe private landowners can play in helping and monitoring efforts as we move forward and as EAB continues to spread. And again, we're going to see these quarantine zones probably expanding over this year as new detections are found. But again, having this readily available for private landowners so that they know if they're in the zone or if they're not in the zone is going to be really critically important as we move forward.
Awesome, thank you. I've seen a couple comments in the chat, but first I'd like to hear from Emily and from Tyler on your thoughts on the poll responses on monitoring.
I was just gonna, oh, sorry, Tyler. I was just going to thank some of the people who've mentioned in the chat, especially that there wasn't a clear option by Mark Berry, who said there wasn't a clear option for more than one county away in Maine. Tyler, John, and I are working very hard on a much broader or a larger scale survey. And so this is really the first time we've in some way presented beyond just our nucleus of the people that we work with closely at UMaine. So that is an excellent point and definitely something that we will work into. And I also really appreciate the comments on farmers, because we have talked quite a bit about landowners and different types of landowners. But I don't believe, John and Tyler, that we've really touched upon people who are using their land for other types like farming. So I think that that might be really interesting to address and look into as well. So thank you. That's super helpful.
Yeah, and just a couple comments with some of the monitoring with the questions that we were asking about the purple traps and the trap tree network. Again, we'll probably need to, have more explanation for private landowners if they're willing to be part of monitoring efforts and what that means to have purple traps or a trap tree that you're going to devote. But one thing that, again, as we're learning more about EAB and monitoring strategies. The purple traps have been used for quite a few years now in our monitoring efforts here in Maine. And the trap trees are becoming really, really important here because they tend to be very sensitive and are really early detectors of EAB in new areas. So the expansion of that trap tree network here in our state, I think, is going to be important because of the value that those trees play. They really tend to do better than some of our purple traps and monitoring efforts. They give us more early warning signs of EAB in certain places. And so it's good to see some of your responses to those questions.
Yeah, I think the original plan was to pop this slide up so that we could kind of give you the quarantine zones and then you could check yourself and respond in the second poll question to whether or not you were correct, right? So we didn't bring it up the first time, and then so if you did, or if you were surprised with where the quarantine zones were in the most recent map released by the Maine Forest Service, you can throw that in the chat. It'd be interesting to see. And I would like to speak to the same point that John made, that monitoring is highly important for establishing the quarantine boundaries and that's really relying on landowners giving permission to the Maine Forest Service and folks to install either trap tree or the purple traps. The trap tree works so much better than the purple trap because it's a real thing, right? We girdle the tree, and what that does is causes the tree to release this stress-induced volatile, and that'll call beetles from the local area to that tree, almost like astronomically better than a purple trap, which is just a little scent strip that tries to mimic that stress-induced volatile. That's why it's so vital and important that we expand that trap tree network, just because of how much more effective it is than the purple traps. Nothing against purple traps. We should also expand that. The more monitoring we can do, the more well-informed our quarantine boundaries can be. And I'm sure maybe this is a good plug-in. We can throw Colleen's contact info if there's anyone on the call that has location that would be ideal for a trap tree. Colleen Tierling with the Maine Forest Service is the contact there to get involved.
I'm gonna ask Logan to find Colleen's info and just drop it in. In the meantime, Gary made a couple of good comments. You mentioned the quarantine zones, which have been really important for combating the spread of EAB in Maine. Gary says changing the quarantine zones is time consuming and requires rulemaking. In the interim, the Maine Forest Service can impose an emergency order. And the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry Horticulture Program does the quarantine, and the Maine Forest Service does the emergency order. There was also a comment from Nancy and again from Gary about another audience to consider, and the movement of firewood. So recreational camp lease owners. Nancy with the Nature Conservancy says, in our annual letters to leaseholders, we include information on moving firewood and pest risks, but including them in a survey might bring the message home better. So thank you very much for that suggestion, Nancy. That's definitely helpful. And Gary says, yes, campers are a very important group that we try hard to keep informed. So knowing how these groups, and second homeowners as well. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think we have maybe one more minute to talk about monitoring before we turn to forest management. So any final comments from our presenters?
Well, I think we'll have some things to talk about with the management, so we could move right in.
Yeah, we will indeed. So Meg, if you wouldn't mind launching the last poll, perfect. So everyone out there, please take a moment and complete this poll. And again, scroll down to make sure that you get to all 4 questions on forest management. I know some of the questions are a little lengthy or a little detailed, but it also, the subject is nuanced as well. So it's hard to say it too simply, or we don't want to say it too simply. All right, the poll results are beginning to come in. Oh, I see another. Yes, and Gary also dropped Colleen Tierling's email into the chat window. So if you think you have a little green bug on your property, or if you want to get involved in the trap tree program or the purple trap program, then contact Colleen. All right, give folks another 20 to 30 seconds to complete this poll on forest management. All right, I'll give you another 10 seconds. And Gary suggested also that you can send detections to bugwatch@maine.gov. Gary, I hate to ask, but are you wearing the EAB tie today? You're probably not going to wear a necktie when it's like 70 degrees out. Not today. All right. Okay, I'm going to end the polling in 3, 2, 1. Bink. All right, and sharing the results for all to see. So our first question, would you consider implementing management practices in efforts to retain ash in our forest landscape, such as collecting available seeds from your local ash trees? Almost everybody said yes, and the one who didn't said maybe. So that's really positive, thank you. Number 2, how likely do you think landowners would be to try forest management techniques that open the forest canopy to allow ash seedlings to grow after EAB has killed mature ash trees? So I know there's a lot in that question. It seems that some folks said likely or very likely, but about half of you were unsure of how likely landowners might be. And one person thought that it was very unlikely that landowners would be open to that. So that's something to factor into communications, perhaps about that as a forest management option. Number 3, how likely do you feel landowners would be to try biocontrol mechanisms such as wasps that eat EAB? 70% thought it was likely or very likely that landowners would be interested. Another 20% of you thought were unsure or thought, and then another 10% thought it was unlikely that landowners would be interested in biocontrol mechanisms. So a little, so more than half think it's likely, but others are unsure or think it's unlikely. And number 4, how likely do you feel landowners would be to agree to use chemical treatment of trees to protect ash trees and seed production? So on this one, it's very different from the seed collection. Now, it looks like half the folks thought it was unlikely or very unlikely. Then other folks are unsure. And then it looks like Gary added, maybe as a comment in the chat window, treating EAB with pesticides is becoming a hot topic among anti-pesticide folks. Concerns about pollinators are very high, and I can't even say that emectin benzoate can be expressed in ash pollen. Bees do take pollen from all our trees, but probably not all that much, but research is needed on this topic. So thanks for that detail, Gary, I appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the results publicly, and I'd love for our panelists to start addressing these forest management topics. Emily, did you want to start us off first with the seed collection?
Sure. So a couple weeks ago, John, Tyler, and I talked with the Vermont Land Trust. And maybe some of you, I think, were on that and heard me talk a little bit about the importance of seed collection and the efforts that we're working on in conjunction and in tandem with what we're doing here. And seed collection is a really important method for a number of reasons: future genetic testing of ash trees, conservation of seeds, future plantings after EAB comes through. There's a number of reasons why seed collection is important and something that we need to be working toward. So we are working on a document that will be closely created with basket makers and harvesters. And so we're really interested in finding private landowners' interests in seed collection and if people would be allowed on the properties for seed collection. So that is kind of why that question is in there. Something that we're really interested in as a forest management avenue.
Great, thank you, Emily.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to Emily's, reasons for some of the seed collection efforts. Again, all ash, like you've mentioned, Amanda, is vulnerable to EAB, but brown ash in particular, for some reason, is even more preferred and more susceptible to EAB. We, in some cases, might see some lingering ash that tend to be white ash or green ash. There've been some trees that have kind of hung on in areas where EAB has gone through, but with brown ash, it's been a different story. And so part of the reason for some of the seed collection efforts underway is that once those brown ash stands are impacted and it goes through one cycle of seed regeneration, it's then lost. So there's really only a period of time when we're going to be able to collect brown ash seed in areas where we have EAB infestations. And so that's why it's so incredibly important. And again, trees are like trees are like people. Of the DNA, the structure of trees, if we are able to find some lingering brown ash in some location, boy, wouldn't the seed be nice to have, for those locations. So the seed collection piece is a really important piece, especially for brown ash. Plus the other thing is, as more science, as we learn more, as other things become adapted to EAB as a food source, we are hopeful that maybe in the future we might be able to plant seeds in locations and reseed places.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you, John. That was all very important as well.
So in the tribal communities, it's a growing interest in collecting seed. I think John spoke to this earlier, but with emerald ash borer in the state, the Wabanaki Key tribal nations here in Maine, it's closer to home. And there's, some serious concern that we could lose our brown ash trees. And we're talking about these conservation practices, and really what's listed in those poll questions, those are adaptive management strategies. So it's great that we're getting some feedback from those of you who have your landowner hats on here today, because that's not necessarily something that you're going to see on woodlots across the state, right? Here on Passamaquoddy tribal land, these are all things that we're considering, and we want feedback from the tribal community to make the best decision. But it's just great to kind of think through this, right? I mean, collecting seed, that takes some time, it's some commitment. Then where do you store the seed? We got to figure that out. It's all stuff that we can certainly get stuff in place to make it happen, and it's important. And I think that with the growing interest of tribal communities, there might even be instances where you bring in ash harvesters to look at your ash trees. They would collect seed while they were there and work with their natural resource departments to store that seed. I think that that's definitely an avenue that we'd like to see. So it's great to see that 90% of the respondents said that they would open it up to seed collection. Then we look at forest management techniques that open the forest canopy, a little bit of a mixed response there. And I agree. I mean, we're talking wetland forests. So entering the site, probably can't use big machinery. We already talked about the lack of commercial value in brown ash. And so it's a harvest that isn't going to give any economic return to the landowner. So that's something that would be taken into consideration as to whether they would carry out this conservation practice. But if we're going to hopefully bring seed into the understory and bring in a young cohort of brown ash trees at the site, opening up the canopy and creating that disturbance before emerald ash borer does it is going to be vital. And so hopefully we can find some cost share programs. I don't know if we have any NRCS folks on the call, but that would be a great program, right? I mean, there's clearly an interest. Folks have joined these webinars and wanted to learn more about emerald ash borer, and both landowners and foresters have an interest. I think that could definitely be something down the line. And biological controls, Gary can speak to this too, that there's clearly a lot of interest in releasing biological controls on different woodlots where they meet the requirements to do so. Hopefully it becomes established enough here in the state, and mixed emotions on it here on tribal land. And we're going to kind of play it by ear and see what the community thinks, but definitely a big part of the picture long-term in terms of managing for emerald ash borer. And there's some requirements to releasing those biological controls, and something that has a learning curve to it. So hopefully our survey kind of speaks to that too. And just lastly, I noticed a comment that the chemical treatments in a forested setting are definitely not as practical, right? But if we're doing good inventory and we're finding ash trees that have seed, so we've got mature seed-bearing ash trees in the overstory. Yeah, we don't want to go in and treat every tree in that forest, but if we can identify some of those select few that are producing seed, and then we couple that with some of these conservation practices that open the canopy and bring seed to the understory, we can really prolong the time in which we're resilient to emerald ash borer in these forests by protecting those seed-bearing trees with the chemical treatment. That also has some issues too. If we're talking about using these trees, if they're brown ash, for the production of baskets, basket makers have a concern that if they have to put the splint in their mouth in the production of the basket, how long is that chemical in there? So another thing we want community feedback here at with the Passamaquoddy Forestry Department on, but something to consider too for landowners, right? That would also be a good conservation practice for NRCS. Get some
And-
cost share on those.
Speaking of landowners, Roger says that he has white and some brown ash in their wee woods, 2.7 acres, and they're open to seed collection. So thank you, Roger. We'll make sure to get you in touch with Tyler and Emily. And then Tom Charles also says, on our 62 forested acres near Farmington, 7% of the trees 5 inches plus DBH are brown ash, fourth most common on the lot. White ash is third with 11% of trees. And he's, so maybe Tom is also asking to volunteer for seed tree collection. Twist your arm there, Tom. But he also asks, what are the methods for seed collection? Tarps near the tree?
So I'm actually going to put in a link to the USDA's document, an online PDF that discusses seed collection techniques. There is tarps involved depending on the collection technique. A lot of times it's using like pole pruners or rope to shake the trees or to actually bring a branch down. Also using a rope saw. Sorry, I was just reading the chat. So you're usually, there is a method of actually shaking a branch or bringing a branch down. There's another document, maybe John, you have it handy. I can also look it up and share it, but Les Benedict has a publication on that as well. Les Benedict, for those who don't know, is works with the St. Regis Mohawk tribe in New York, and he is kind of an expert on seed collection and somebody that we're working with very closely. And so part of the work that I'm going to be doing, and John and Tyler, I'm sure will be involved with at some point, is creating a document that's geared toward the non-researcher. So unfortunately, I am providing a document that is written by scientists, but we're really working to create a document that's a little bit more friendly to a more diverse audience. But that's not fully in existence yet. So for now, I will just put in a couple links. And seed traps, I think it kind of depends on the method and who's working on it. So I don't have an example of seed traps that people use, but that is something that I will definitely look into. So thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, I could definitely envision maybe a future webinar or some kind of training program on seed collection.
There is also there are a couple other organizations that have done online trainings that you can watch. The Mama Network in New York, I think they're in the Hudson Valley. They have some videos that you can watch online from 2020 where we couldn't all meet in person. So there are some other organizations that have worked on collecting and sharing those sorts of things as well. So I will just grab that link from Les Benedict to pop in the chat before we all have to go.
Yeah, and I know we're running out of time a little bit, but I also just wanted to mention, again, the evolving research that's being done around EAB and efforts. And one thing that we haven't talked about today is integrated pest management, where there's a combination of these tools used together. And again, there's research kind of showing in some cases where EAB has been addressed in some of the urban areas where they've done a combination of chemical and biocontrol to the extent in one town, they no longer need to chemically treat the ash. The biocontrols are at a population level where they're keeping EAB in check. And so that's just one town where they're kind of monitoring those efforts. So again, as we learn more through some of our research efforts, I think that will help inform some of our towns and cities here in Maine as we kind of consider what we do with our ash trees in our towns. Do we cut them, or do we treat them, or what kind, or a combination? What strategies do we want to do with our ash tree populations in our towns and cities that ultimately will need to be addressed? Because if you don't do anything, you know, EAV is likely to kill them, and you'll have to cut them or take care of them before, you know, especially if they're hazard trees.
As you can tell, there's a lot more to be said and to be learned about this topic. And again, we're hoping to put together a webinar series for later this year. Thanks everybody so much for participating. This has really given our presenters some really good food for thought as they develop this survey and do what they can to lead the charge in trying to combat emerald ash borer in the face of climate change, in the face of not the best timber harvesting practices. And yeah, Tyler put his contact info into the chat window, so please feel free to follow up with Tyler, with John, with Emily. Thank you all for helping us elevate this issue and to support our Indigenous colleagues in the important work that they're doing. If you need SAF CEUs, make sure that your name appears correctly in Zoom. We look forward to seeing you on future FCCI webinars. Thank you very much, everyone. And thanks so much to John, Tyler, and Emily.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.